Welcome to worshiptutorials.com. As you can see, we have a pedal board in front of us and the Line 6 HX Stomp. In this video, I'm going to go through sort of some best practices, some tips for you if you are currently using a stomp with your pedal board, or if it's something that you think you might want to look into. It is a lot of fun, super creative solution, and I'm just going to say it. 2022 is the year of the pedal. At least here at Worship Tutorials it is, because this stuff is too much fun and sounds too good not to use. And it's really easy to integrate it with the digital modeling, profiling, capturing systems that we all have that sound great, that are extremely powerful. The two can live together in harmony. I gotta get rid of this pick. Now I can do it. The two can live together in harmony. They can coexist. So I'm going to break this video down into sort of different steps or tips that I use when I set this board up with the stomp, and different ways that you can run a stomp with a board. Before we go any further, I just want to say all the patches that you're hearing on the HX Stomp are available from worshiptutorials.com on the HX Stomp page. Link for that below. We have a lot of free stuff for you on that page. Everything that you would need to get yourself up and running with a stomp is there. And if you haven't already subscribed to us here on YouTube, now's your chance. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell icon, so when we upload more videos like this one, you will get notified. So the first thing that you have to decide when you set up a stomp with a board is, do you want to run the stomp as a stereo device, or do you want to run sort of 1 amp block so the amp is in mono, and you can still do stereo effects with it. Now, the way I have it set up with this board is this whole thing runs into the stomp. So the stomp is at the end of the board. You can just imagine it would sit right here on the board. I'm running it at the end of the board, and this whole board runs in stereo once it hits the H9. So it's important for a setup like this that I have 2 amp blocks, 2 IR blocks, and that everything in the stomp is running in stereo. So what I want to do now is I'm going to jump over to HX Edit, and I'm going to show you what that routing has to look like if you want to run the board in stereo, or you want to run the stomp in stereo with your board. All right, so here we are in HX Edit. I'm going to show you how I have the routing for this patch set up. This is the patch that I played that intro part on. This is what I would use for a stereo setup at the end of a stereo board. So the first thing that you want to think about is the main left-right input is where you're going to come in. You can also come in on the return if you want, or via USB. Either one. So I have the input gate off. You can use that if you want it. It doesn't, whatever works best for your situation. The first thing you have to do, this first split, so you notice I have the 1 amp on the top row, 1 amp on the bottom row. And if you don't have the amps first, like if you have something else in front of it, make sure that it's in stereo, whatever you do, because whatever is if any of these blocks are mono, it's going to sum your whole signal into mono. You don't want that. Unless you do want that. But in this case, we want stereo, so we don't want that. All right. So the first thing I have is this split. It takes my signal. Now, the default setup when you get it from a patch, typically, or sometimes our patches, or if you just make a split, is the balance in A and B are going to be centered. You want to split it so that A goes left 100, B goes right 100. This keeps your stereo signal stereo. Okay, and then the left side is going to go through this chain, and the right side is going to go through this chain. So here we've got one of the amps. We got the, this would be the AC30. This is the Lone Star. This is the IR for the AC30. It's our 60s silver. This is the IR for the Lone Star. We use the Match Laurel Canyon, which is a G12 H30 Heritage Edition. It's a great sounding speaker. The next thing to keep in mind is the split after the amp, or after, you know, your amps, whatever, wherever the split ends. This, I think by default, might come in centered as well. You're going to want to do the same thing. The A side is going to have to go all the way left, and the B side all the way right. Okay, so then basically what you've got then is when your output is left-right stereo, it's panned center. That means everything is running in stereo. Now, one thing you have to remember is every block that comes after this has to be a stereo block. Otherwise, it will sum your whole signal to mono. So you can add whatever you want after. If you want to add a chorus after this, look, we don't have many options open to us in this scenario. When we're in stereo, basically we can do a tremolo or a tremolo. That's all we can do, a tremolo. Now, if we take this reverb out, that's what comes with this patch if you download it from us. If you take this reverb out, now we have a lot of different options. So we can add, you know, a chorus, and this is all going to be in stereo. We can add a delay. We can add a lot of stereo delays are available. Vintage Digital is a great one of my favorites. To put in there, or the dual. A lot of stuff you can add to a patch like this, but just remember, it has to stay in stereo. Okay, so I want to show you now what you can do if you download one of my favorite patches from us, the 66 AC Top Boost. This is what it looks like when it comes from us, right? And say you want to use this patch, you like the way this sounds, you want to use it with your stereo board. So we're going to take essentially a single amp stomp patch, turn it into a stereo dual amp stomp patch. It's really simple. I know I'm not going to want the compressor. I don't want any of this stuff in front of the amps. I might want to keep this. I might want to keep that EQ. I might want to keep that, you know, delay. I might not have room for that reverb. Let's just get it out of there for now, just in case. So basically, I moved this prematurely. So you remove the extra stuff that you're not going to need because you're going to need DSP as well. You have a single amp. And in this case, we have two IRs with that amp block, okay? So we're gonna move this split. We're basically gonna recreate what we did earlier. We're gonna move this split and we're gonna make it so that it keeps our stereo image, right? And then we're gonna take this amp block, move it over and copy it and move it down to that amp block. And so now what we've done is we've recreated that setup where we've got the same amp, but it's in stereo now. So it splits into stereo. Left side runs through this and then comes out through that IR. Right side runs through this amp block. It's the same amp block, but it goes through the other IR. And then remember, we have to adjust this at the other mixer block and pan that stuff hard left and right to retain that stereo image. And then so long as everything after that is in a stereo block, it'll retain that stereo image. So now we can take this patch, run a stereo board into it, and it retains the stereo image, and we get the tone from that 66 AC Top Boost. And you can do that with any patch that has a single amp block in it. You just have to remove stuff because the Stomp doesn't have quite as much DSP that you would need to like run a bunch of extra stuff. But, you know, we could run, boy, when you go stereo, you can run either Glitz or Plateau. Of course, these legacy reverbs are available to you. You can run modulation in stereo after this. Whatever you want to do, you can add stuff in, but just make sure you retain the stereo image. Okay, the other way you can run the Stomp is you can run a single amp block, or if you're using like the Pod Go and you're using external pedals with it, this is how you would do that, or FM3 for that matter, would work the same way since it's a single amp block. Now, the amp blocks in the Stomp are not stereo. So that means if you run effects into a single amp block, that sums everything into mono. So you have to think about, if you're just going to run one amp block in your Stomp, which you can do and it sounds great, I'm going to show it to you in a second, you have to think about where it goes in your chain. So like I said, in this scenario, all of these effects, all of these stereo effects are running into the Stomp. The Stomp retains the stereo image all the way through. But what you can do is put your Stomp in front of your wet effects. And then, so your drives, for example, basically would be compression, and your overdrives would run into the Stomp, and then you can come out of the Stomp in stereo into stereo, you know, modulation, reverb, delay, what have you. So you can run the Stomp in mono, or the amp in mono, essentially, and then use stereo effects afterwards. And that actually lets you get more mileage out of your Stomp, because if you're running two amps, two IRs, in the Stomp, you really don't have a lot of room for extra effects in there. So now I want to show you how you can set up a patch where you're going to run it in the middle of your chain. So you're going to run the amp block in front of your wet effects. You're going to use one amp block. You're going to run all your dry effects like compression, gain into that, and then come out of it. You can either come out in mono or stereo depending on what you want to do. So let's just go back to that AC 66 top boost that we just had. I didn't save it, so now we've got it back to its stock form. Let's keep the tremolo in there. Why not? And then we've got the amp block, and it's in mono. So really, what you can do is you run into the left input of the Stomp. It hits the trem. It hits the amp. Then you can, at this point, it hits the IRs. And then we've got a little bit of stereo imaging, but from here you can really do whatever you want. Now it's going to hit this stereo delay and stereo reverb. So at this point, the patch is in stereo. So you can come out of the Stomp in stereo into other stereo effects. Like if you've got a stereo modulation, reverb, delay on your board, you can come out. The cool thing about the Stomp, and the Helix does this as well, if you choose only to come out in mono out of the left output, it will automatically sum these stereo effects to mono for you. So if you had, this delay doesn't do it, but if you had a delay that was set to like boom, ba-dum, bump, like on either side, it'll sum that stuff to mono for you, which is a really nice thing. There are actually lots of pedal manufacturers build pedals to do that. Like the interfacer, from Goodwood is a pedal. So this pedal can, the Stomp can act as like a summing pedal for you to like truly sum your stereo stuff to mono. If you need that, it's a nice thing that it does. But that's how I would set this up. So just for the purposes of this board back here, I'm gonna set this because I like the 66 AC patch. I don't need the modulation. I'm gonna leave the amp there. I'm gonna leave the IRs as we did them in the patch. I'm gonna leave the EQ. I'm gonna turn this off and this off. Now I'm gonna save this. I'm gonna take the Stomp now, plug it back into the board, but I'm gonna put it in a different spot, and I'll show you here in a bit. And then I'll show you what this is gonna sound like with the wet effects and stuff after the amp. All right, the table configuration has changed. So now what I've got, I didn't tell you this, I have the sneaky little send and return loop built into this board. So I took that that 66 AC top boost patch that we just modified over in HX Edit, and I have this send and return loop built into my board. Usually it's just patched with this cute little purple patch cable, but what it does is basically it lets me insert anything I want right after the Duellist, which is my last overdrive, and before the H9, which starts my modulation, reverb, delay stuff. Okay, so you can use it to test a drive pedal out, which I do all the time. It's a lot of fun. But in this case, I've just inserted the Stomp. Now I could throw a Kemper in there. I could do anything I want with that send and return. But I've got the Stomp. I'm running into the Stomp in mono. I'm running out of the Stomp in mono back into the board. So there's the send, there's the return, and then it just runs through everything. So it sounds like this. Now the amp block is in front of all the wet effects. Okay, and then I'm just running out of my board straight into Logic via the Apollo. All right, now a couple things to note. So that works really well with any sort of patch that just has one amp block and maybe one IR cab or maybe two cab blocks. What this does though is it gives you a lot of freedom with the Stomp to add more effects. Now I could run multiple delays and a reverb in here. I could run modulation, delay, and reverb. Like it could take the place of 3 of these pedals if I wanted it to, and run that amp all at the same time and sound great, and you still get a stereo output, because all of these wet effects are still going in stereo, and I'm running stereo out. So you can essentially get stereo without running stereo amps with the Stomp. Now, one other thing to mention, when it comes to running wet effects after the amp block, you typically have to increase the mix a little bit. When they're in front of the amp, the mix needs to come down. When they're after the amp, the mix needs to come up to get sort of the same level of wet. So here's my plate reverb and my quarter note delay again with the amp in front of it. So you can hear it's really low in the mix. So I'm gonna turn the mix up. There it is, the effect level. I'm gonna turn it up from where it was. That might be a little too much. Maybe a little more. Do the same thing with the Golden. So that's a quick example, but the principle is true. If your wet effects come after the amp, you're gonna wanna turn the mix up higher than if they're in front of the amp to get the same sort of level from those effects. That's something that it took me a while to really learn that. I didn't know that starting out, and I would just kind of set everything the same, and when it would go in front of the amp, it would be like way too much. Then I'd dial it back, and then if I move that behind the amp, I'd be like, where did all my reverb and delay go? Just remember that amp block it brings things up and down depending on, it's all about where the gain is relative to where the wet effects are. So once you've got your placement of the Stomp in your signal chain and whether or not you're going to be running stereo amps or a single amp into either mono or stereo effects, the next thing that you need to think about is how are you hitting those amp blocks with your signal. So I'm going to demonstrate. We're back to the original patch that I had, that AC Lone Star patch. I'm going to show you what it sounds like with nothing on this board on. So all you're hearing now is the signal running through all this stuff into the HX Stomp, and it's just running those 2 amp blocks, 2 IR blocks, and the stereo EQ block at the end, and it sounds like this on the bridge pickup. Okay, so what you might hear is it doesn't sound all that special, right? It's got good bass tone, but there's not a lot of sauce on it. So the thing that you want to do, and I like to do it with a compressor, and you can use a compressor in the Stomp as well, but what you want to think about is whatever you're going to have always on. Some people run like an always on overdrive, sort of shapes your tone, gives you options for different guitars, that kind of thing. Whatever you have that's always on that has amount of gain, turn it on and listen to what it sounds like just into the amps. And then I'm just going to turn a little bit of reverb on because it's nice to hear with the reverb. So now with my compressor on, it sounds like this. And that's pretty much exactly what I want to hear from my clean tone. It's really like edge of breakup tone. And I love using a compressor, specifically this compressor on this board. There's a lot that will do this, but I like this Empress Comp because it lets you, like, I can adjust the output from this compressor right here. Right, so if I want my amps to sound cleaner, or if I have a guitar with higher output pickups, I can pull this output back, or I can push it up and push those amps harder into more breakup. Now, the other thing you can do is if you have a compressor, you can't really adjust output, you want to go to the amp blocks in the Stomp and adjust like the level of drive, or you can even put a gain block in front of the amps, and you can do this in stereo as well. It doesn't take much DSP if you have the space for it, and you can just pull the gain back a little bit to give it less signal, or push it to give it more. It will act kind of like what this level control does on my compressor, but that is the sound that I want. The next thing you want to do is try your drive section. So now I've got my bass tone. Hit the first stage overdrive, which is this king of tone. And then the big one, the scarab. Now that all sounds great to me, but I've gone through and I've tweaked this board. But what you want to do then is first get your bass tone, your clean tone, and then tweak your drives, especially if you like to stack them. Like here's the king of tone, and then I'll put the Duellist on after it. Sounds great. So step 2 is gain staging. Get it right. It's really, really important. And you want that bass tone to be exactly where you want that, right on the edge of breakup is where I like it. Okay, the third tip is going to be how are you going to set your wet effects up? Now, in this case, we're back to this original configuration of this board, which is how I like to run it. Whether I'm running into the Stomp or the Axe Effects or the Quad Cortex, I like running the board into the amp. I like it when those wet effects hit the amps. They kind of get all, like the amp does its thing to all the wet stuff. It sounds really cool. And I find that in the digital realm, like if you have a Helix patch, this is an aside. If you have a Helix patch or an Axe Effects patch or FM9, what have you, and you run the digital wet stuff into, and I realize this is all digital wet stuff too, but if you run the Helix models or they don't really get the same vibe as when you run a board into these devices, and those wet effects hit the amps, which is why for most of the time for the patches that you get from us anyway, we put all the wet effects after the amp block. I actually kind of like running them in front with the board. I like them both. They both have their different flavors. I'm going to talk about both of them because you have to approach things differently depending on how you do it. So in this case, I've got all the reverbs, delays, modulation running into the Stomp. So the first thing I'll show you is just a quarter note delay from the DD500, a plate reverb from the Golden, running into the Stomp, nothing on the Stomp except for amps and the EQ. Sounds like this. Okay, pretty subtle stuff there. Now I'm going to turn on like a bigger dotted eighth delay and a bigger reverb from the Golden so you can hear how that sounds. All right, so that sounds great. Now, where it gets a little bit messy, I guess, is when you start to add a gain to that scenario. So, first thing to do is play it clean, get it to where it sounds like those repeats are present, but they're not taking everything over, and then add some gain. I'm gonna do that first with the King of Tone, just a little bit of gain. It sounds like this. So what I hope you notice there is when you add gain and all your wet effects are in front of the amp, everything just kind of gets pushed up. So one thing to keep in mind is if you're going to go big gain sounds with big wet effects, make sure that your wet effects are not just completely taking everything over. I've actually got these on the verge of too much, in my opinion. It still sounds cool, and the Stomp actually handles these wet effects really well. Line 6's amps models, they sound great. They handle wet effects like actual pedals in front of the amp. I think they handle it better than they do the models inside of it, like if you use the delays and reverbs inside of the Helix or the Stomp, for example. I think it sounds a little better when you run it like this. Maybe I just need to tweak it a little more to get it right. One thing that I will point out is, like, on a lot of our patches and a lot of people that make patches, or you might do this as well, you have this button here called amp gain. And what that does is it raises the level of gain on the amps. One thing to be aware of, I don't like using that when I run it with a board. And the reason is, when you turn the gain on the amp up, it basically recalibrates how these wet effects sound completely. So I've got the King of Tone on. I've got the big delay and the big reverb sound on again. So this is kind of a driven sound with these big wet effects. It sounds like this. Now when I turn on this amp gain, it turned the gain on the amps up. Listen to what it does to the reverb and delay. It's just way too much, in my opinion, because what you need to do is, if you run your effects into a higher, into an amp that's gained up more, you've got to turn the mix levels down on the effects to compensate. So you have to consider where the gain is in relation to the wet effects. If the gain is coming from these pedals, for example, the gain is in front of the wet effects. So it's going to push their levels a little bit, but it's not going to just completely recalibrate the way they sound or change the whole nature of the mix and everything like that. Now, when you turn the gain on the Stomp up, the gain is after these wet effects. So it completely pulls them way up. As you heard, they just completely took over and it was way too much. So when you're using the Stomp in this situation, like I am, after your board, I don't like using, personally anyway, I don't like using like a button to gain up the amps. It's a really cool sound, but it doesn't work well with the wet effects in front. Now, if you're running the board where the amp block or blocks are in front of your wet effects, it'll act just like these kind of gain stages, because the gain now is in front of the wet effects, so it's not going to completely change them. So this next tip for the Stomp sort of assumes that you're using the Stomp like I am, to basically take the place of the amps and maybe like one or whatever other effects you can fit into it. In this case, you could have a reverb or a delay or even an overdrive or modulation effect with this patch that I've got on the Stomp. But if you got it on your board in that kind of a scenario, you have and this is what makes the Stomp such an awesome pedal. I think it may be the coolest pedal ever made. Line 6, I'm just gonna say it. If you see this, I declare the HX Stomp is probably the coolest pedal that's ever been. Because it can do so much and does it so well. So, and it's such a great utility and size and that kind of thing. It's awesome. So what you can do is you can have like your main board, your main amp patch like this, for example, and you can have multiple ones for different guitars. You can just really tweak it and dial it in. But then if you have a situation where you can run your board into an amp or into a couple amps in stereo, it is such a great Swiss Army knife. You can have a completely different patch that's just called board or something like that, where you can have all kinds of crazy, awesome effects, because Line 6 just keeps adding so much cool stuff into this thing. And then you can have like just an extra effects patch that you can pull up at any time. I'm sure a lot of you probably already do that, but if you don't have that scenario set up, like build a patch with a lot of cool effects built into it, or you can download like our favorite pack from Worst Tutorials for free and get all like the settings that we like for these different effects and throw it into a patch, set the buttons up so they can, control what you want to control. And if you go somewhere where they have an amp that's a backline, like at a church or something like that, or if you happen to pick something up, like the Stomp can grow with you. Like if you decide, oh, I want to get like an FM9 or a Quad Cortex, or maybe Kemper releases something new. And this is January 2022 right now. So maybe in February, March, April, May, June, July, Kemper releases like something that will run 2 profiles in stereo, and you want to get that. Your Stomp can still be an extremely useful, versatile pedal that you can use to run all kinds of effects into something like that if you want. So make up a patch that's just like all your favorite quirky, cool stuff built into the Stomp and have it ready to go just at the press of a button. It's pretty awesome. All right, so the fifth and final tip. This is for those of you who do not yet own an HX Stomp, or maybe you just got one, or you're thinking about getting one, and you play through it, and your experience with it is, this is nothing like an amp in the room with me. And I would say to you, it's not designed to be. So one thing you have to remember with a Stomp, or with anything, with a Kemper, with an Axe-Fx, with a Quad Cortex, with all of these digital modeling devices, what they are modeling is the output of a microphone on a speaker of an amp. So if you're used to playing like a tube amp in the room with you, that is an experience that is not the same as playing like an HX Stomp through headphones, because you've got the speaker, you're hearing the raw speaker, your ears are acting as the microphone when the amp in the room situation. What the Stomp is giving you is the emulated output of like taking a microphone and miking that amp. So if you really want to compare apples to apples, if you will, you would need to take that tube amp that you're used to listening to, put an SM57 or a Royer 121 on it, put it in a different room so that you can't hear the actual amp, and then listen to the recorded output on a set of monitors or headphones or speakers. That is what the HX Stomp is giving you. And in our experience, it's extremely close. Like, all these digital modeling devices are really, really close. So our final tip with HX Stomp is, like, especially if you're used to running a board into a tube amp and sitting in the same room as that tube amp, the Stomp is not designed to give you that experience. You can kind of get that experience though with something like the power cab from Line 6. So you could run the Stomp into the power cab. A lot of what that is just volume coming out of a speaker, a lot of volume coming out of a speaker and you being close to it. So you can replicate that with an FR or some sort of a speaker, emulator like the power cab, something like that. So I wanted to throw that out there as a sort of a final tip. If you're new to Stomp, or if you're thinking about coming into HX Stomp or any of these modeling devices, just so you know what to expect coming into it. All right, a couple final notes about the Stomp. The way that you set up your inputs and outputs, your global settings, are important. I'm going to link below, or I'm just going to write it in the description below, but maybe there'll be a page on the site too where you can go. Definitely where you can get all of these, but you know what, we'll just put it on the HX Stomp page on the website. How I have it set up if I'm running it with a board, because the way if you run it with a board, you might want to set it up a little different than if you run it into front of house or something like that. So I'm going to show you the global settings. I run the volume all the way up on the thing. That is unity gain for Line 6 stuff. I'm going to add that all below in the description and at worshiptutorials.com. So if you're curious how I'm running it specifically in this video or in the setup when I run it with a board, that'll be available to you as well. And just also, I want to acknowledge that there are, like, this video barely scratches the surface with the HX Stomp. There's so much it can do. It can send and receive MIDI. It can control all these other pedals if you want it to. It can do so much, and we're barely scratching the surface. But I wanted to kind of go over the basics of setting it up. The gain staging thing was a really big one for me, especially like the amp gain. If the wet effects are in front of it, that's a big deal. And the stereo thing, I wanted to show you how you can take any of our patches that we make available, whether they're single amp presets or dual amp, and turn them into stereo patches that you can use with a stereo board, or set them up to use them inside of a board running into a single amp block and then stereo afterwards. So those are 5 tips for maximizing your HX Stomp along with your pedal board. Hopefully this was helpful to you. Thanks for coming along. Thanks for watching. Let us know in the comments below. Are you running an HX Stomp with a pedal board? And if so, what's your setup? What's your rig? Maybe we can kind of inspire one another, because you can be infinitely creative with all the cool stuff that's out there these days. Subscribe again to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.